Making smalls is great. I get it, they're fun, compact, and you can bunch out a ton of them in a weekend. But what if I were to tell you that there was a way to make 10 times that all in one go? I've made all sorts of projects, from a £10 bottle opener right up to large custom made coffee tables. And what I can tell you is this, that if you're not integrating these custom builds into your marketing strategy and sticking just to smalls, you're leaving money on that table that your workshop deserves. And before we get started, there's one secret that I'm going to let you into. It ain't half as scary as you think it's going to be doing custom builds. So today I'm going to show you 3 custom builds that I've done that you could adapt in any situation to sell for yourselves. We're going to be looking at how much the materials cost, how much I sold them for, and how long did they take me. That way you can compare this to the smalls that you make and sell and decide whether there's value for you in making custom builds as well. Now, if you've not got one already, I strongly recommend getting a planer thicknesser. This has genuinely been one of the best upgrades I've made. It's changed the way that I buy timber, and it also helps get such a good finish even for those parts that you've pre-bought. And now that we've got everything smoothed and planed, it's time to take things down to our final dimension. I've only got a very little bit to take off here, but you'll find with this, what it will allow is to cut up and outside of all those small minor imperfections like knot holes. Once the full length has been through, it's time to get it into the halves that I need. This way I can maximise the amount of wood that I can use from this one piece. I find, especially for custom pieces, it's really important to make sure that you get the best grain orientations that you can. There's nothing worse than finding that one of your pieces looks out of place once you've glued up. Marking and measuring is one of the most important parts of custom woodworking. For me, I love this trend angle finder. It makes sure that your blade is 90 degrees square each and every time. The great thing about working with thicker pieces of stock is that you can reinforce all the joints with biscuits. Don't get me wrong, it does nothing for strength, but what it does do is aid with alignment. This stops your pieces floating up and down within the glue up, and that means that there's less sanding to do later on, which helps keep down the amount of hours that you're going to commit to this project. Now, this task can be done by a biscuit jointer, but let's face it, that's yet another outlay that you're going to have to make. Instead, use your router and pair it with a little slot cutting bit. Buy some biscuits and off you go. This thing will work just as good as a proper biscuit jointer. Whilst it's important that we glue the boards, it's also important that we make sure there's plenty of glue in the hole for the biscuit. There's no point having a dry fit in there because it won't help. What the glue does is it makes the biscuit swell to ensure that that joint is nice and tight and that there's no movement at all. And this is why marking is so important. It's made sure there that the grain orientation remained consistent in the pattern that I wanted it. Once we start putting the clamps on, you can see the size of this thing and tell how big it's going to be. Now, I know we've used biscuits for alignment already, but I like to double down on commissioned pieces. I have to ensure that this thing is completely flat. There's nothing worse than trying to pass off amateur work for a decent amount of money. So for this reason, I've put some cores on this piece to keep everything nice, snug and in place. And as the piece comes out, I square off the ends with a mitre saw. A good tip here, if you have not got the capacity to cut this off, is to do one half, flip the piece over and complete the cut from the other side. Now, I love how this project's coming together. The oak board looks fantastic, but I fear it's going to get lost on the wall when it goes up in the golf club. So I've got some Meranti offcuts from another project and I'm going to use these to frame the piece. That should really make it pop and draw your eye into the centre, which is where I want people to be looking. Now, one thing I should really explain is how to get a custom sale. I like to run some stalls, only a few a year, because let's face it, who likes talking to real people? But whilst at a stall, I got an inquiry about fixing a table for a golf club. It was a dead simple and little job that I did for free, on the basis that I thought a golf club would have some money and they might want further work if they see that I'm any good. And this is the byproduct of fixing a table for somebody. So with the final piece coming together, it's on to the last bits of sanding, making sure that this banding is absolutely silky smooth. I don't want anyone to be putting their hand on it and it not feeling great. Now this is the part that really scared me with this project. There's 3 hours worth of engraving on this, and once it starts, there's no way to put it back in the same place if anything goes wrong. Whilst the engraving was going, I started making some discs or tokens that are going to hang from this tree. For this, I slimly cut down, slimly is not even a word, so I cut a small shim out of the material so I could laser cut it. As you can see from how this is going together, these small little tokens are going to sit in and around this tree. What they're used for is to signify every time a lady from the golf club gets a birdie. And the great thing for this is, as the years go by, I'm quite sure I'm going to get more orders for more tokens, so again it's going to be doing that little bit of repeat work. Granted, the tokens aren't going to be much to cost up and they're not going to provide much income, but it still keeps me in somebody's mind for when they want more products making. With the piece going in such a high traffic area where people will be leaning up and touching it and adding things onto it, I wanted to make sure it had a really robust finish, so I used some wipe-on polyurethane. 5 coats later and a polish, and this thing was looking absolutely fantastic. The hooks were purchased from Amazon and cost less than £1. This is a great way just to keep your costs down, buy some hooks and modify them yourselves to the shape and size that you need. So now that we're looking at the beauty shots on this piece, let's talk money, time and ultimately profit. The oak itself cost me £25. This is what you get when you find great places that sell seconds. On top of that, I used £5 worth of 5-minute epoxy. 5-minute epoxy, or maybe even 5-minute epoxy. So my total outlay was £30. I'm able to do the lasering myself, which means that there's no additional cost. I sold this piece for £150, and if I'm honest, I probably undervalued myself because the only option I could find to buy this online was a £400 one on Etsy. Granted, that came in a full case, which I wasn't prepared to do, but I could have maybe charged another £30 to £50 more. But I didn't. So what did I make? Well, it took me 10 hours to build completely, and that takes me down to £12 an hour. Look, you're never going to be a millionaire with that, but if you're a hobbyist like me, just looking to put money back in the workshop, £12 an hour is honestly not a bad return. Now let's talk difficulty on this one. To look at this piece, you would think it was really difficult, but think of it another way. It is just like a large chopping board with some hooks on it. That's all it is. If you really had to, you could have bought those tokens to add on, so there wouldn't have been any sort of outlay there. And let's be honest, you could have bought those tokens for... So now that we've finished the birdie tree that went to the golf club, let's have a look at project number 2. And project number 2 is a Union Jack chopping board. This is another project that looks so complicated, but I'll let you into the secret. It's really not if you get your processes sorted before you start building. Honestly, much easier than you think. So far for this build, I've got some oak and I've got some mango, and I'm going to have to try source some other scrap material that I can use to create the contrasting colours that I need for this build. The best place I can think to find this is going to be in my little hardwood scraps box. So into the mix now, I've managed to add some maple and also some walnut. I've got all the pieces that I need. Everything should contrast nicely. Let's start milling this lumber up and get it to the dimensions that we need. So back to the build now. I'm using the templates that I made earlier to mark out all the different pieces I'm going to need. I found here that a red pen works really well on walnuts and other dark woods. With our marks made, it's time to trim down yet again over on the table saw. A couple of quick passes has all the lengths at the right size that we need once more. Over on the chop saw, I've got a shadow line that helps me line up all my pieces. This was a little bit finicky and it took 2 or 3 goes to get everything lined up how it needed to be, but because the angles were always repeatable after that, once it was set, I could leave it where it was. So with the oak and walnut cut, it's starting to take shape, just the maple to go. And for this, the process was exactly the same as before. So it's time to make a quick right angle jig, and I'm going to glue everything up in smaller sections. That way I should retain some level of control over how these pieces glue together. With this jig only needing to last a couple of hours, CA glue's plenty strong enough for this. If I was to make a bunch of these together, I'd also look at screwing it in from the back just to add some extra stability. And after putting a small dab of glue on each piece, it's time to clamp it up. Using this right angled jig really helped to attach the clamps to and keep everything square. Now the first set of clamps I put on was a little bit fiddly, but once I'd figured out the orientation, the other 4 went on dead easy. Once the glue's set, I square off the 2 inner edges, leaving the outside edges slightly longer. I can always come back later and trim these off a bit. And as I get more sections complete, the puzzle seems to grow. Eventually I'll get this into 2 halves that I can then glue together to make one final piece. Trying to put this thing together was one of the most stressful glue ups I've ever done, and I seem to say that with every glue up. So once we're out of the clamps for the final time, it's time to start trimming away. A flush trim saw really helped on the first bit, and once I was thin enough to go through the planer, I've glued the life out of this thing. So I made sure to take really shallow passes, and I put a sacrificial piece on the end to make sure that I didn't have any snipe. Whilst I love how smooth the planer makes things, it also shows up the small imperfections in the glue up. So it's time for that age old trick, dab a little bit of glue into the gap and sand over the top to fill any holes that are left. After that, it's time to square up over on the table saw, and this is where my camera skills come into their own. I have got a beautiful shot of the back of my head and a complete blurred image of the flag getting trimmed. And there we go guys, the finished article. I'm absolutely made up with this. It's come out brilliantly. But let's have a look at the results for this Union Jack chopping board then. All these materials came from scrap, so there is £0 laid out beforehand. Time wise, it took a lot of evenings because there was a lot of gluing up, but the actual hours weren't that many because gluing something together doesn't actually take that long once you've made all your cuts together. The cost that I charged for this was £50, and I think I've probably got about 6 hours in there. So you're at somewhere around £8.50 to £9 an hour. Now there are ways that you could make more from this. You could engrave it, you could make it a different size, you can make it end grain and up the price a bit. But there are tons of things you can do if you take this base idea and adapt it for what your setup and what your skills will allow for the market near you. Now that we've finished with project 2, let's move on to the third and final project. This is a sink cover. Now this had some unique personalisation, not in the form of branding or engraving or anything like that, but it needed some tap holes cutting out of it. Faucets, if you're American and want to use a very weird word. What that meant is there was a degree of accuracy and this could have gone wrong. This is where you've got to double check your measurements and make sure that you're right, but it is possible. Let's have a look how we got on with this one. For this project, the customer had chosen some Marante. It's a beautiful looking wood that's neither light nor dark, but comes up with a sublime finish. I came away from my local woodyard with 2 huge pieces, and this needed a bit of resawing. Luckily for me, my new Evolution table saw made light work of it and left a real neat finish, only requiring a couple of quick buzzes through the planer to make it silky smooth. Now having a wood muncher like this is absolutely fantastic, and I can't believe how many small workshops I see persevering without one. If you can make your shop work for you and earn a few pennies, then it's well worth the investment back into your workshop. Tools don't make you better, but it makes processes easier. With the timber all milled up nicely, it's time to move on to checking how we want this board to look. Really important here that we take considerations into how the grain patterns are, what board's going to look good next to which one, and is there any sort of colour differences. Once I've done this, I like to mark on by drawing a big triangle, mainly for no other reason than everyone else does it on YouTube. But joking aside, I don't like to use numbers. To help me with jointing, I've started numbering the sides of the board 1 and 2, meaning that number 1 goes through the left hand side of the table saw, and number 2 goes through the right. That means that you get a perfect joint every time. So the last thing I want is multiple numbers, because a simple nugget like me will easily get lost. Now this is where the triangle that we marked on earlier is really useful. It makes sure that I get my board back in the correct order now that I've made some cuts. A very loose clamping and a quick check with a straight edge shows just how neat these joins are. These are lovely and crisp and should glue up really well. But to make sure that we do get perfect alignment, I'm going to add some biscuits to this build. It's going to hold a little bit of weight being a sink cover, so I have to ensure that there's going to be no bend or flex. For this, I'm going to use some biscuits. They don't add any structural strength, but they are going to make sure that my alignment is bob on for glue up. I've got my own little template that I've made on my laser, and I'm going to use my palm router with the slot cutting bit. This is lovely and quick, and it took me about 10 minutes to do all the joints in total. You simply run the router through the jig, going from side to side, turn your router off, move your clamps and repeat. And again, this is another way that I reduce that pressure. Things like biscuits that help with alignment stop slips and slides during glue ups and things coming out of kilter. Little jigs and techniques like this are worth their weight in gold. The cost of the bit was about £3, and the jig I've made myself from some scrap. And it's these little changes to my workflows that are paying off so well. It's making my work look like it's at the next level, whilst also making things easier. So after a quick dry fit, it's onto the glue up. I like to push all 4 boards together, gives you a bigger surface area, stops glue slipping out all over them faces. There's no point going to all that trouble planing to have to do tons of sanding later. Another way I'm stopping the stress is by working smarter, not harder, not repeating steps or making problems for myself further down the line. And I'll happily tell you, I've been my own worst enemy at times, making things harder than they need to be. Now so far so good with this glue up. Time to add the clamps, and if I'm honest, this is the only pressure that there should be in woodworking. That was horrific, I know. but hopefully the glue joints won't be. So let's see as we come out of clamps now what they're actually looking like. And I'm absolutely amazed at how flat and smooth this is. This has been a fantastic glue up. Now no sooner are we out of the clamps and it's time to trim to its final dimensions. We've already got the width sorted with the table saw, and now it's onto the DIY track saw to cut the bottom and the top. If you're not in a position to buy a track saw yet, this is a fantastic alternate. It's not perfect, but compared to the stress of freehanding, it's another great way of reducing down the burden. One thing I do know for sure is if I can make a jig for this hole, I will take out some of the stress because I can get that jig right first before I make a cut on my actual board. Just another way to reduce the pressure, because once you cut into this thing, you can't add it back on. So after applying the template, I've drilled a pilot hole and now I'm on with my hole cutter. This is great for the sides. It's going to leave 2 or 3 mil at each side, so I've only got a tiny little smidgen to route off. The closer you can get to that line without touching it, the easier this process becomes. But as a word of caution, don't go over the line because it makes it impossible to come back from. I know, I've done it, and you're right, that did add pressure. Thankfully I've not done that on this build, and after the hole's been cut I just need to take the straight pieces out and we have the majority of the material hogged out. As you've just seen, I've set the router to the right depth. I'm using a compression bit that's got an up and a down cut to make sure that I get a perfectly crisp cut. This bit works by running the bearing against the template, making sure that the cut is absolutely flush and to the exact dimensions that we need. Again, another way that I'm keeping my anxiety and stress levels down is by making sure that I use the tools around me to make the job as easy as possible. Now the next part of this build also needs a template, but I'm going to do this one different and use some scraps of MDF. I need to measure out how big my hand is because this is going to mark out where the hand holes go. I'm then going to use the router to run along the top of those MDF pieces, and this will give us a controlled, defined area that gets cut out by the router bit. So once the measurements are transferred onto the board and I'm happy that everything is squared and central, I'm going to use the chop saw to chop up some MDF, some double-sided tape yet again, and it's going to be a quick and simple jig. So for this cut, I'm changing to my fixed base router. That's because I need a little bit more control, and the 2 chunky handles give me just that. It allows me to counterbalance the router as it's gliding over the top of the jig. To ensure that I get a clean, crisp cut, I'm going to make this in 2 passes. The first pass is going to hog out the vast majority of the material. The second pass is going to be really shallow and will clean everything up nicely. After I've finished routing, it's on to sanding, and this is where I find that an oscillating multi-tool comes into its own. It's these little jobs that no other tool gets into that makes these things so versatile and so worth the money. So we're on to the home straight and we're adding the feet. Another little jig that I've used here is a marking guide for little rubber feet. It's simply got a couple of positive stops and slips over the corners. I can then take the feet and the little screws that come with it and screw them easily into the pilot holes. Now I've got to put my hands up to this one because I have deleted the footage of me putting the finish on, which is gutting because this thing looks so beautiful. Luckily for me, my client has kindly sent me through some pictures of it in situ. And again, this is another project that's come out great. I charged £80 for this. That's mainly due to the fact that the Marante cost me quite a bit, so I've not made as much on this as I would have liked to. However, it's £80 back into the workshop, of which just over 40 of that is profit. The great thing with this is that I had a very happy customer off the back of this. Well, that means more referrals. That means somebody else that's pushing my work. So when their friends want a chopping board, when they want a sink cover, when they want something for their house that's unique, bespoke and certain to be just for them, they're going to get directed towards me. So never underestimate what it's like having a happy customer that's going to push your work just as much as you are. And like I've said with the other ones, when you look at it, it's just a large rectangle. Now you could modify this for your market any way you want. You could put some branding on there, you could put some sides and back on, you could change the handles, you could have metal handles on the top. The options are endless, and that's where these projects are great, because if you take those base ideas and build upon them for what your clients want or what your market area will allow, then you can sell these anywhere. What you've got to look at though is where you're going to get referrals for these custom orders. Now for 2 of these projects, I got them directly from doing stalls. So for me, one of the things you need to do is look at how you're going to get these referrals into the custom world. I got 2 out of these 3 referrals from running a stall. The stall where I was selling small items. And can I tell you a secret about which items I was selling? It were these 3 right here.